What is up, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Breathe and Air podcast, where everyday action meets extraordinary mindset. Today, we have probably the most traveled and awarded guest that we've had on this show. His blog was named in Time Magazine as the top 20 in the world in 2010 for a travel blog. He is the host of Everything and Everywhere, a recent podcast that he puts out episodes every day for. And he's also, like I said, one of the most awarded photographers when it comes to travel photography. Gary Arndt, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about how you got into this world of travel and a little bit of your story there.
It kind of started out back in the 90s. Right after college, I had started a very early internet company back in 1994. And it grew pretty fast. In 1998, I had 50 people working for me. I was 28 years old, and I sold the company to a big international firm. And then I kind of conned them into sending me around the world to talk to their regional offices about internet stuff. So in 1999, I did a whirlwind 3-week tour where I went to Tokyo, Taipei, Singapore, Frankfurt, Brussels, London, and Paris. And that was the first time I'd ever really been anywhere, and I really liked it. And so I started a couple other businesses, and I didn't know what to do. I went back to school for a few years, and I came up with this idea of taking a year to travel around the world. I was going to just sell my home and travel. So 2007, I sold my home, and I just kind of never stopped. So I ended up going like 9 years without having a home, just traveling around the world. And for the last 5 years, I had a house, but on an apartment, but I traveled up maybe like a half to a third of the year. And this year I haven't done anything. So,
Right. Times are a little bit different, especially in the travel world right now. There's no doubt about that. You mentioned that you sold your house in March of 2007. And through that thought process, where was this idea of, I'm just going to get rid of it all and I'm going to go travel? Were you wanting to do that for an extended period of time, or did it just happen that way?
I wasn't planning on doing it for as long as I did. I told everyone I'd be gone a year. I thought maybe I'd be gone for 2. But yeah, I just really enjoyed traveling. And once you start, you kind of realize how big the world is. And I also started a website, and that became kind of popular. And that allowed me to just sort of keep doing it full time.
Yeah. Was the website kind of an afterthought, like, hey, I'm going to do this as I go, or did you set out knowing that you're going to start the travel blog?
Well, I started the blog right away because I'd always had a personal website. So that was just a natural thing to do. But it began growing. I developed a following right away. Not a lot of people. But by like, say, 2010, it had become pretty large. And by that point, the travel industry had then sort of, was starting to wake up to what was happening online. They were kind of late to the game. They still kind of are. And that was at that point, I had a lot of savings from selling a business and a house, so I wasn't in too much need for money. But yeah, it eventually kind of came something over time. When I started, nobody was, making a living off a travel website.
Yeah. You mentioned that they still kind of are behind the times. What do you mean by that?
A lot of the money in the travel and tourism industry is spent by tourism boards. And the funny thing about tourism boards is they don't have to show a profit. And they can't really show a profit, right? It's a governmental organization and they're promoting their destination. And one of the problems is, so they don't really have to show that what they did anything. So what they end up doing is spending a lot of money on just high profile things, because all they have to do is then turn around and go to their board of directors or their boss and say, look what we did. Oh, we can't blame us. We bought an ad on CNN, or we did this for, this major magazine. Regardless of how effective it is, it doesn't matter. They just need to kind of do what everyone else is doing, and then that's sufficient. So the goal isn't to grow a company or to make a profit. It's to not get fired.
Right.
Well, I mean, that's really what it is. And if you're not being fired, you're successful at your job.
Yeah, that's definitely not the way to go about it, I would say.
The most visited city in the world is Paris, and I don't think they have a tourist board. And they don't need one. I don't know what they're going to do. What are they going to do? Show pictures of the Eiffel Tower? Everyone knows the Eiffel Tower. I mean, it's completely unnecessary.
Right. That seems a little unorthodox there. In terms of this content creation that you're doing along your way, you are almost ahead of the wave of everything that is termed content creation, right? You had these multiple ways that you were pushing your journey and your travels along the way. What were some things that you learned about creating content that people gravitated towards to help your success?
Well, when I started, I was doing something different. When most people go around the world, they go to major cities of the world, and that's just kind of what they do, right? So they'll get a ticket and they'll go to London, Paris, Rome. They'll stop in Dubai. They'll go to Bangkok, Sydney, Hong Kong. That's what they'll do. I started out, I spent the first 9 months crossing the Pacific Ocean, and I went to Vanuatu, Samoa, Kiribati, Tonga, Micronesia, all these places that nobody goes to. And so that started me off doing something a little bit different. And then my travels were always just kind of a little bit different in the things I focused on, which was tend to be going to more obscure places, not just obscure countries, but even places within a country that are not the obvious ones. And so many people now, if they have a travel website, all they focus on is SEO, which means they're trying to rank for search results, and search results are for things people already know to be searching for it, right?
Right.
Um, if you look at the most popular national parks, say in the US and Canada, you're going to have Yellowstone, Yosemite, Banff up in Canada. These get millions of visitors a year. Best national park in North America is Nahani National Park.
It's so funny you say that. I had that written down to talk about.
It gets 800 visitors a year. And I talk about this on every interview I do to prove a point. No one's going to visit this place, even though it's amazing, because it's hard to get to. It's in the Northwest Territories of Canada. There are no roads connecting the park to the world. So it's not going to make a difference. And I can talk about it all I want, but it doesn't mean that people are going to actually end up going there.
Right.
Especially a lot of travel has become impressing your friends. When I started, Instagram didn't exist. Twitter and Facebook were a thing, but they weren't a big deal at the time. So it was all about my website. And now you have a lot of influencers, and their job is to take pictures of themselves in front of things all over the world. It doesn't even matter what it's in front of. They could have a green screen for all that matters. But it's to show, oh, look at my life. Oh, it's so luxurious. I'm in this place. And they're not actually doing anything. And I've traveled with some of these people, and they are some of the most intellectually vacuous, stupid people in the world. And they don't care. They're just trying to get the likes and whatnot. And me and a lot of the people I know that started doing this back when we did, because there was very little in the way of social media, there was no money to be made. We were just doing because we loved it. And that still kind of remains the case.
What was so incredible about Nahani? And it's so funny you mentioned that, because I saw one of your posts about it and I'm like, this looks incredible. Like what was your experience there, and how did you even find it?
Well, I'm working on visiting all the national parks of Canada, and that was one of them. And it's also a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and I've visited almost all the World Heritage Sites in the US and Canada. I've been to over 400 around the world.
Wow.
And Nahani was actually one of the first 12 World Heritage Sites ever created back in 1978. And it was up there along with Yellowstone National Park, but almost no one knows about it. Even most Canadians don't know about it. It has one of the largest waterfalls in the world. It's called Virginia Falls. It is higher than Niagara Falls. It has a water flow on a par with, say, Victoria Falls in Africa. It's amazing, and nobody knows it exists. There's these massive canyons that are there. The Ram River Gorge, not as big as the Grand Canyon, but as canyons go, it's pretty impressive. Some just incredible mountain peaks, the Cirque du Unclimbables. And like I said, 800 people visit a year. More people can go into Yellowstone in an hour in the peak season than visit Nahani in a year.
Wow.
So you have to drive. There's one or two places you can get a plane. One is Muncho Lake in northern British Columbia, and the other is Fort Simpson in the Northwest Territories. So getting to the place you can get on a plane is hard, right? It's a very long drive. Then you got to take a float plane into the park.
Wow.
And your options are 1 day, flying around the park, seeing everything, or 2 weeks. There's really no in between.
Yeah.
Right? It's not like, oh, I'm going to camp for a few days, and maybe you could do that, but you're going to be very limited to the parts of the park you can explore because there's really no, like I said, no roads, no trails, no visitor center, no signs, nothing. It's just wilderness.
Right.
And there's a lot of amazing places like that just no one, they don't know about it. And even if they did know about it, they probably wouldn't go.
It seems like you kind of carved your niche out in that area of, hey, these are places that aren't your like typical travel spots. These are places that maybe people don't know about. Do you think that really attributed to some of like the early success with the blog?
The early success, but the thing is, there's a reason why the Sandals resorts in the Disney worlds make so much money. It's because they play to the mass market. The number of people out there who are even interested in visiting Nahani is quite small. There's another national park up in northern Canada called Wood Buffalo National Park. It is the largest national park in North America and the second largest in the world outside of Greenland. It's enormous. You can drive there. You have to drive all the way up through Alberta into the Northwest Territories of Canada and then kind of hook around, and it just barely dips back into Alberta. So it's a really long drive. But you can get in a car and you can just go there. Anybody can. And no one does it. And it's another one of those things where it's just people, they don't know about it. And there are places, I'm talking about national parks. There are just amazing places in Europe. It could be Roman ruins or whatever, but there's only so much room in people's in the popular consciousness of what they know. How many Americans can name a city in France other than Paris?
Probably not a lot.
Not a lot.
Wow.
So if they're dreaming of going to Europe, they've already limited themselves to going to Paris because they don't know of anything else outside of Paris. Now, I'm not saying Paris is bad, but everyone goes to Paris, right? Everyone, if you're going to Italy, you're going to go to Rome, you're going to go to Florence, you're going to go to Venice. And everyone does those three places. There's nothing wrong with those places. But you're talking about a country where every single village has some bit of history or a battle or a church or something. And most people just don't know about it.
Yeah. Your podcast, Everything Everywhere, it really emphasizes how much knowledge you have on a lot of these small facts and this history and this, history that's rich at a lot of different places that you've been, and even just cool facts. Like I saw one on Andre the Giant the other day. So,
oh yeah, I'm a huge wrestling fan.
Yeah.
And it's the second wrestling show I've done. And, the Andre the Giant is interspersed with, episodes about ancient history, World War II, science, stuff like that. But yeah, he was a fascinating guy. I mean, he was huge and probably the greatest drinker in the world.
I would assume.
There's drinking and there's drinking, right? So he's a 550-pound, 7'4" guy who spent a lifetime drinking. So he is very immune. And his feats were so legendary that when he was drinking with guys, they would literally count the number of beers. One evening, he was recorded to have consumed 156 cans of beer.
Oh my God.
He was on a flight with Ric Flair to Japan. He personally consumed all the vodka on the plane. He had a flight from Miami to Dayton, Ohio. You know those little tiny liquor bottles on planes? He consumed 50 of them.
Oh my God.
And there's just tons of stories like that where his drinking was just incredible. And he was so big that nothing fit him. He'd go to a hotel and they didn't have beds his size. He couldn't even use the toilet in a lot of places. And then there were reports of him literally having to take a crap in a bathtub because it was the only thing that worked.
Yeah, that would be 500 pounds. That's insane. And
it wasn't like he was a candidate on My 600-Pound Life, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't like, oh, I can't get out of bed. We got to knock a hole in the wall to get him out.
Yeah.
He was just big. That's just what he was. And he didn't work out. He didn't lift weights, but he could just manhandle anybody.
Yeah.
Like there are pictures of him with Arnold Schwarzenegger. They were doing a movie. And Arnold's just this tiny guy. This is peak Arnold, by the way, right? Not old man Arnold. And he was just nothing. They had dinner once or something, and Arnold went to go pay the bill, and whoever said he was going to pay the bill. Andre literally picked him up in his chair and moved him and said, "I pay." And so, yeah, he was a fascinating guy.
Yeah. I would not want to get gripped by those big hands. I mean, his hand would probably swell on my whole face, I can imagine. But
a can of, there's a picture out there that has this of him holding a can of beer. And the can, if you were looking at the back of his hand, you couldn't see it. It was so engulfed. So when you hear him drinking of 100 cans of beer, they're just these tiny little things for him.
While we're on this topic, what are some wild out there experiences with alcohol or wine, or what are some of the different types of experiences that you've had like that when you've been traveling?
Oh, I don't have a whole lot of that. I'm not a huge drinker personally, especially when you're traveling alone. It's usually a horrible idea.
I would agree.
There are certain things I've had, like soju in South Korea, that I just thought was horrible.
Yeah.
I've had other things like the hard ciders that come from northern Spain are fantastic.
Really?
Like, I've gone out of my way to look for them in the United States, and they're hard to find, but they're just amazing. They're extremely dry, but they're not like a cider that you would get in the U.S., which tend to be very sweet. It's really one of the best drinks. I've had some sake, some sparkling sake, that were amazing as well. Although I only had that in New York, I didn't have it in Japan. Yeah, in every place in the world, soft drinks are universal. You'll find Coke and Pepsi everywhere. Beer is always unique to that place. The most universal beer is probably something like a Heineken, and even that's not very big. Right. Almost every country has their own beer.
Yeah. If I know you've probably heard what's the best food, but maybe just what's some of your favorite places for cuisine along your...
Japan would have to be number one. No doubt about that. I've had, some of the best meals of my life there, even when I couldn't communicate. I was on this one little island in southern Japan, and no one there spoke English. I didn't speak Japanese, but you kind of let it be known it's that time of, it's dinner time. Let it be known you want to eat. So they brought me out this set meal, and it was amazing. And to this day, I don't know what I had, but it was like the best meal I ever had in my life.
Yeah, that
Argentina is also great. If you're a vegetarian or a vegan, just don't go to Argentina. Just don't bother. It's not worth it. The beef there is absolutely amazing. Their barbecues and asado are fantastic. I would literally fly down there like just for steak. That's how good it was.
Incredible. Is it something, do you know if it's something that they do, how they prepare it, how the cattle's raised?
I think it's a combination of some of the cuts, and also they don't tend to age their meat. So if you have, and it's mostly beef, just because, in the Pampas, it's this huge grassland. So they produce a lot of beef. And if you eat something, it probably was butchered within 48 hours, wow. Usually, but not always. And just, if you go out and they have these big, asados, it's also just in the presentation, and they'll literally have a rack of ribs up against a huge, wood fire. Very different than how we do barbecue in the United States, especially in the South, which is its own. If I was to say there's one unique American cuisine, it probably would be that barbecue, but it's different in different states, obviously.
Yeah. I'm a huge barbecue fan. I love me some barbecue. You're one of the most decorated, I'm pretty sure I saw within the last decade in North America, as far as travel photography goes. You've won a plethora of awards. So did the photography come with the travels? Like, hey, I'm going to document what I want. Or how did you get to being such a distinguished photographer?
When I started traveling, I bought a really expensive camera thinking it would take good pictures. And then I learned right away that that's not how it works. I took really bad photos with a really nice camera. And so I just began taking the time to figure out how the camera worked and everything else. And it was just an iterative process. And then eventually I started submitting for awards and actually winning stuff. Um, although I have not taken my camera out of my bag now. It's been almost a year. I was in last February, I was in Portugal, and that was the last trip I took before everything shut down.
Yeah. What is the state of, the travel industry right now? Of course, it's, in a weird situation with COVID, but do you see it recovering anytime soon, or is it going to be forever different?
Not going to be different anytime soon. Um, I keep hearing everyone talking about stuff, and when this first started last March, I thought this was going to be done in
Yeah.
like it was mostly in China at the time, right? Everyone's like, "Oh, don't go to China." And I knew some people in China, so we were actually talking about possibly, doing something in China, maybe in May of last year, once this was done. Well, that didn't happen. And then I thought, oh, maybe I could run a tour of national parks. Yeah, maybe in the fall once everything's done. Well, that didn't happen. And yeah, at this point, I'm not even guessing anymore. It's not going to be like overnight where we're going to declare victory and everything's going to go back to normal. It's not going to be that way at all. Um, I don't know. I mean, I'm hearing people saying now that, and even it's not even a matter of issues of health or the virus. It has to do with people's perception. So it may not be until 2022 until things really change. I don't know. So I'm not even making predictions or planning at this point. People ask me, I get it a lot. It's like, oh, where's your next trip going to be? It's like, I don't know.
Yeah.
I have nothing scheduled, and I'm not even gonna. I've traveled a lot, like a lot.
Yeah.
And I'm good for right now. I started a new podcast. I'm keeping busy every day. I'm doing a whole bunch of stuff to better myself. I'm learning, some languages, something oddly enough that I didn't really do when I was traveling. And I'll travel again.
Yeah.
I know that. I don't know when. And so I'm not going to try to second guess it. And then from my perspective, different maybe from anyone else's, because this was my business, I don't know when the industry is going to be at a point where they're going to start spending money on marketing and advertising, even once people come back, because that's not their biggest priority. They have employees, they have, other assets that they need to stay alive, basically. And that's not their concern. So even if people start traveling, it may be 1 or 2 years after that before that level of spending gets back to normal. So I don't know.
With selling your house, going traveling, and then coming back to the States, did you take that minimalistic, mindset back with you when you came? How did your mindset change from,
Yeah.
selling your house and then coming back to the States?
So when I started traveling, before I started traveling, I had a real nice house. It was like a 3,000 square foot house, which was way too big for me. Um, I had an amazing home theater. I had a 106-inch projection screen, which by the way now would be ridiculous because the TVs have gotten so good,
Yeah.
In the last decade and a half. Now it's, yeah, I don't, when I stopped traveling, I got a rather small apartment, and that was fine. I had a good internet connection, a really big computer monitor, a TV, and TV, and that's one of the biggest things that changed. I remember, like, I left the U.S. for several years. I came back. I went to a Best Buy, and I'm like, all the TVs are different because the flat TVs used to be really expensive, and somewhere along the way, that's all there was, and they became really cheap, and that's been a huge change. But yeah, I don't see the point in having a lot of stuff. I remember packing up all my crap when I first started traveling, put it in storage. And when I got done traveling full time, I remember taking a lot of it out of storage, and it was just like I'd hit a pause button for 9 years. And I remember taking, like, everything was in the same condition. The clothes, I had, it was like I just put them away. And I had so much crap that I'm like, what am I going to do with this? And so I ended up either selling or getting rid of a lot of that stuff. I
Yeah.
still have a lot I'd probably get rid of.
Right. I've read a lot on the minimalistic lifestyle of how we have all this stuff that we really don't use. It just takes up space. And I'm sure it was an awakening of some sorts for you in that facet. But when you're on the road traveling, you've mentioned that you stayed in hostels before, you've stayed in 5-star resorts before. So when you set out, did you really know where you were going to stay, or were you just kind of rolling the dice?
I never plan anything. So it's not uncommon at all for me to show up in a city with no place to stay. In fact, that's how I usually do it. It's gotten a little bit easier. So when I started, we didn't really have smartphones. And even for several years later, roaming was very difficult. So it wasn't like you could just, pull something up. You had to find a Wi-Fi connection and deal with all that. Now it's trivial. You just pull out your phone, you pull up a hotel booking site, and you just get something. And it's almost never a problem. And it's certainly not going to be a problem for several years, because I don't see even major cities selling out rooms anytime soon. It's only really blown up in my face once, and that was I was in Tokyo once during a holiday, and everything was booked. So I ended up having to stay in a capsule hotel for 2 nights, which was kind of an adventure of its own.
What's a capsule hotel?
As the name implies, it's not a room, it's a capsule. So imagine like a bunk bed with a door you can close, and they just stack them up like 3 or 4 high.
Wow.
And that's a capsule. They're designed for originally Japanese businessmen who would stay out late and miss the last train, because the trains in Tokyo don't run all night. Why, I don't know. And so you could just stay at one of these things and then go to work the next day.
Is there a proper way to do travel in today's day and age, or is it kind of, you do it the way that you want to do it?
Just do whatever you want.
Yeah.
I've come across people that say I'm a travel coach. I'm like, what sort of coach? It's like being a NASCAR coach. Go fast, drive left, turn left. That's all the coaching there is.
Right.
Get a plane ticket, go somewhere. That's most of what people need to deal with in terms of travel is just confidence if they're not well traveled. Right. I remember when I first started, I basically went west. So I started in Hawaii, spent a few weeks in Hawaii, learned to scuba dive, did some other stuff. Then I went to Tahiti. And that was the first place I went to where they didn't speak English. And it was really intimidating. Now, if I were to do it, and it's not like my French is any better, but you just become more confident in your ability to get around. And I've been to so many places. You could drop me in the middle of, Turkmenistan, and I'll be fine. I'll figure out a way to do it. But that just comes with confidence and experience. And the only way you do that is by traveling.
Yeah, that comfortability. Is it achievable for everyone? And is it something that they can do on a budget per se? Like, were you budgeting? I'm sure you were budgeting throughout. You had obviously sold a business, but how does someone travel and say, hey, I want to do this, but maybe I don't have a whole lot of capital to start with?
It depends how you do it and where you go. If you want to travel around Western Europe, it's just not going to be cheap.
Yeah.
For example, if you go to Zurich, Switzerland, you can go to a youth hostel, you can get a dorm bed, and that'll probably run you about $50 a night. You go to Bangkok, you can stay on Koh San Road and probably get a place, a bed for $5 to $10 a night. Yeah. There's just nothing that you're going to get in Zurich less than that $50, because it's Switzerland and it's just expensive, and that's life.
Right.
So if you go to Southeast Asia, you're going to be able to spend a lot less money. And the other thing is, most people, when they travel, they're on vacation, right? I'm going somewhere for a period of time and then I come back. And while you're gone, it's not like your landlord or the mortgage company is going to say, oh, well, you weren't using the house, so you don't have to pay for it. You have to keep paying for all the stuff you were paying for, and you're on vacation.
Right.
But if you're traveling full time, you don't have all that other stuff. No rent, no mortgage, no utilities, no property taxes, no insurance, no car. All that stuff goes away. And if you add up all the expenses you have, that's a lot. And that, you can stay easily in some countries for, let's say, $300, you can get a room for a month. And then food is also super cheap on top of that. And
Right.
again, no utilities, no insurance, no, other than maybe travel insurance, which is actually really cheap. Um, so you can travel far less than you can probably live at home. And most people don't realize that because they're not putting themselves in a situation when they do travel where they can take advantage of those savings.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes sense whenever it's like the list of subscriptions that you didn't even know exists that you just consistently pay. And you're like, oh, I actually,
And I should say, a lot of countries are wising up and they're making it attractive for digital nomads to come live there. So Barbados just did it. Estonia has done it. More and more countries I'm seeing like every week are letting people stay for up to a year if you have a job that you can do online. And there's a lot more people now that are working from home due to COVID. And even when this is over, they're probably going to still keep working from home because a lot of companies have found out their employees are more productive when they're not in the office, and they're not spending money on office space. I had a friend who had a business in New York and they had office space there, and they just canceled their lease. And now everyone works from home. And you'd never know the difference because they just keep doing what they're doing. It's a website that they run. And you don't have to be in an office, especially paying prices, in New York or San Francisco, where so many of these companies are, and they're paying the highest real estate costs in America. They could save all that and just work from home. And once you're working from home, well, home can be in Thailand or Costa Rica or wherever.
yeah, that is one of the changes from COVID that I think has been a positive if you look at it that way. And even it could be a positive for the travel industry when some of this starts to dissipate a little bit. But being like the productivity, like you said, still being able to be productive while working remote may encourage that more travel.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think I read somewhere like at least, 30 to 40% of most people right now have a job that could be done remotely.
Yeah.
And so for most people, it's just a psychological barrier to go do it in a place that's far removed from where they currently live.
I'm about to go to Cabo, so I'm in a little bit of a tropical mood, and I thought I would ask you, where is one of your favorite tropical destinations that you've been able to go to?
I'm a big fan of the Pacific, and it's a place that not a lot of people bother to visit because it's so far away.
Yeah.
So, for example, if you wanted to get to Fiji, it's like a 10-hour flight from LA. Um, but once you get there, it's pretty affordable. And a lot of these islands get very few visitors. If they do, they're going to be people from Australia and New Zealand because that's kind of close. But places like Samoa, Tonga, the Micronesian places, they don't even get the Australians and the Kiwis because it's just north of the equator. The only flight to like Micronesia or the Marshall Islands, there's just literally one flight, and it goes from Honolulu to Guam every other day, and it just stops at some of these islands. It's called the Island Hopper. And these are countries that maybe get 10,000 or less foreign visitors a year. And a lot of those 10,000 are people there on business for whatever reason.
Mm-hmm.
I went to Tuvalu, which is the least visited country in the world.
Wow.
And there's nothing to do there, but if you ever want to truly find a place, I've literally been on white sand beaches by myself. There's just no one there. And if you want an experience like that, you don't go to a resort. There's a place called the Yasawa Islands in Fiji that's super cheap. And when you fly into Fiji from the US, you land in a city called Nandi, which is on the west side of the main island. And there's a boat. And once a day, it goes up and down the Yasawa chain. And it stops at these little village run resorts. And you can get a place, your own bungalow, for about $50 a night. And it is right on the beach. When I mean right on the beach, I mean like you can be from your bed to in the water probably within 15 seconds. And most of that's going to be opening up the door and the fact that you can't run fast on sand. And they usually include all your meals with that. So you're really just paying for beer, which tends to be like $1 a bottle. And the people are nice. They speak English, but no problem. But again, it just most people don't bother to go because they don't know about it.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of pictures in your photography of certain animals and kind of close-ups. What are your coolest or craziest animal encounters along your travels?
Um, well, probably the greatest one I did was photographing polar bears up in Manitoba. Churchill, Manitoba is probably the best place in the world to photograph polar bears. And I got to go on like one of the premier tours, which is like the last one of the year. And I did it on a year where the ice came in late, which is bad for polar bears, but good for photographing polar bears. Because when it comes in, because the polar bears feed on seals. So when the ice comes in early, the reason why this spot is great is because the polar bears all kind of congregate there waiting for the ice to come in, because it's the first place the ice comes in on Hudson Bay is this particular spot. So when the ice comes in early, the polar bears are out on the sea, they're hunting, and they're not around for you to take pictures of them. But when it comes in late, they're all just sitting there. So one day we saw like 43 polar bear.
Wow.
And you're in these things called a tundra buggy, which the best I can describe it, it's like a school bus crossed with a monster truck, where it's these massive monster truck wheels that are like 5-6 feet tall. And so the bears can come right up to it, and they can even stand up, but they can't, reach anybody that's in it. And you can get some pretty good shots. I remember once I flew into a small lake in northern British Columbia, and I'd never really gotten a good shot of a moose. And there were all these moose on one end of the lake. So the floatplane landed. I get in a canoe with this other guy. We go to check out the moose. The moose are gone. Oh, well. So we paddle back. And on the way back, there's this big bull moose sitting in the water. And he's chewing on weeds under the water. So he'd put his head underwater, and then he'd pick his head up, and all the water would just drain off of his antlers. He just kept doing this over and over and over. And so I just had these amazing photos of this moose in the water with water dripping off his antlers. And eventually he got sick of it and went away. But that was just an incredibly lucky encounter.
Yeah. How did your mindset change from seeing all of these things throughout your journeys that you've been on? How does it change your mindset and the way that you think about the world?
I meet a lot of people that have opinions about different places around the world. Let's say like the Middle East. And the first question I always ask is, "Oh, when were you last there?" And I know the answer. The answer is they were never there.
Right.
Because when you go to a place, all you hear about on the news is bad stuff. That's the only thing, because if it's not bad, it's not going to be on the news. So when I ask people, like, what do you think about the country of Colombia? What comes to mind? People always say, like, drug lords.
Right.
That was 30 years ago. The problem is nothing has replaced that in our consciousness. So that's still what's there. When I went to Vietnam, everyone said, "Oh, what do they think of the Vietnam War?" Well, that's the only frame of reference Americans have for the country of Vietnam is the Vietnam War. Because if we didn't have a war there, there'd be no reason for us to think of Vietnam at all. So that was the only question they had to ask, not realizing the French were there for 400 years. And then for the last like 5 years, we were there. The French got up before us, leaving us holding the bag. And then it's been almost 50 years since then that they went on and had a life of their own. But that's all we can think about, because that's all most people know. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of the way it is for a lot of the world. They don't either, they think something bad because of what they heard in the news, or they think nothing at all.
Yeah. This day and age of media and clickbait, like you're saying, nothing good is actually going to be on the news and Instagram. What is your take on all of these new developments in technology, and how is it affecting the world poorly or positively?
It's not technology so much as how we use it. I think that most of the advances have been great.
Right.
The problem is, I was around at the very early parts of the internet, like before, Netscape was even a browser. And there was a lot of talk of the potential of the internet. All of that potential was achieved. You can go and take physics classes from professors at MIT for free online. You can learn anything you want. There's so much information. And the problem is almost no one does it because they spend their time getting outraged. And that's one of the biggest drivers online is people figured out that outrage drives traffic, drives views, drives clicks. And so there's this constant desire on the part of a lot of people, including the social media platforms, is to make you as pissed off as possible all the time. And I have some relatives that are like this, and it's always, politics. Oh, and it's like you do realize all the cable news channels, the reason why they've become so partisan is because there's more money in it. That's all. It was a conscious decision. And being in the middle and being unbiased, there's no money in that, right? Because people want outrage and they have to fill a news cycle 24 hours a day. And when one thing ends, they need something else for you to be outraged about, some statement, some whatever. And it's a never ending thing. And so one of the things I've, personally done, I have a Facebook account. I have muted every single person that I follow on Facebook, all of them, whether I'm really good friends with them or not.
Yeah.
Same on Twitter. Every person I follow, I will not see any message you ever post. I have muted everything because I just don't use social media for seeing all this, what everyone did and, what they think of this. I don't care.
Yeah. It's a good way. It's a good way to do that. And I speak a lot about monitoring what is being fed to you on a consistent basis. And it seems like you have the correct equation for
consume long form content. That's if I could think of just one way to encapsulate it. And the problem with Facebook and all these other things is that it's very short and it's very shallow and it doesn't mean anything. Rather than looking at my Instagram feed and seeing one photo of a national park, go online and watch a documentary about it or something like that, and that's personally where I've been making a big shift. And I have very big audiences on social media, and I've really reached a point where I don't even care anymore because it's so shallow. And the nice part about having a podcast is you're creating something of actual content. And I have a daily podcast, and as podcasts go, it's a rather short podcast. It's about 10 minutes. But I write out the entire show. It's not an interview show. So I have to write out a script, and it's something every day someone can learn something so they can at least kind of better themselves. So even 10 minutes compared to social media is still kind of long form content.
Yeah, it is. Absolutely. It definitely is. Not in the grand scheme when you look at how much time you're spending on social media, though. And that's the thing. It's like, oh, this podcast is an hour. Okay, well, you scrolled 3 hours on your phone today or whatever it may be. People always find the excuse to do the latter, even though it's maybe not something that's better for them.
Go for a walk. I just read an article the other day. You've always heard about you should try to get 10,000 steps in every day. The article was suggesting that maybe the new version of that is to just be outside 2 hours a day for your own sanity and your own health. And when you're doing that, or if you're just going for a walk, one of the best things you can do is listen to a podcast. Right? You can listen to something. And I have a whole host of shows that I listen to, and I don't listen to any shows with comedians. I don't care about celebrities. I think that's all kind of garbage. I just usually listen to like history shows or stuff like that, or even where you if it's an interview show where they're bringing in people with, who've written books or who have some sort of interesting take on something, not just people kind of rambling.
Yeah, absolutely. Tell me a little bit more about Everything Everywhere and where the idea came from and what the consumer is going to hear if they come and check out the show.
The how part of travel never interested me. And that's what most people talk about. Oh, this hotel, this airline. It's like nobody travels so they can stay in a hotel, right? There's been people when the pandemic started, it's like, oh, we're offering a flight experience. And it's like, you're on the ground, but you sit it's like, that'd be horrible. Like, if you want to know what a flight is like, take an uncomfortable chair, put it in a closet, have a TV dinner, and shut the door for 8 hours and watch something, watch a movie on a very small screen, and that's flying. And then every so often just bounce the seat around to experience turbulence. What's interesting is the why. You want to go somewhere. And a lot of people, like I said, are content to just go somewhere and take pictures of themselves so they can show that they were there. I'm always interested in what is there and why it's there and the story of this place. And I think if you take that approach, it makes travel far more interesting. But it also really expands the universe of what you can see in a place. I've been to Rome several times. It's one of my favorite cities. Since I started doing this show, I've come up with a massive list of things the next time I'm in Rome that I want to see. And they're all things that no one ever goes to bother visit because everyone's too busy. They go to the Colosseum, they go to the Vatican, they go to Trevi Fountain, but they don't see this other stuff, which may be buried, or maybe it's just something very small, but there's this incredible story behind it. So the podcast, I had this idea for doing a longer show. And the first episode I was going to do was to answer the question, why is the Mona Lisa the most famous painting in the world? Because by all rights, it shouldn't be. It's a picture of a woman who's not famous. She's not royalty. She's not a religious figure. She's not a saint. It's not Mary. If you think of what all the paintings were like back in the day, it's just this random woman. So I'm like, why this? And then I also heard a statistic that 25% of the people that visited the Louvre go to the Mona Lisa and leave. So I started doing research behind this and getting to the background on the Mona Lisa and everything else. And I had enough notes to do like a 2-hour show.
Yeah.
And I realized that this was probably not going to be a good use of my time. So I started to put that aside. When the pandemic started, I went back to the idea, but this time I kind of changed it around. So instead of doing these really long shows, to do really short shows. And because one of the problems we have is we have algorithms showing us everything. If you're on Facebook or some sort of social media, it's showing you what they think, it's showing you what it thinks you want to see based on what you saw in the past. And I'm sure you've experienced this. You watch one dumb thing on YouTube, and then it's showing you the same sort of stuff over and over. If you search for stuff on Google, you obviously have to know what it is before you search on it. So there's very little room in the world anymore for what's called serendipity, to just discovering something and accidentally, uncovering it, because everything is fed to you in this programmed way. So the show is every day, and it's something completely different, and you never know what you're going to get. And it allows for this form of serendipity that can't exist in algorithm-driven social media. And I've had a lot of people that just say, like, yeah, I didn't even know that I didn't know that. And that's really cool. And I never would have known about it if it wasn't for the show, because you need that level of serendipity.
There is a lot to be said for what you just said there, but it is interesting topics. There's so many different, like you said, history, and we talked about the Andre the Giant, or McDonald's bringing the McRib back. Like, these things are so interesting to me, and I think a lot of people would find it the same.
Oh yeah, I just did a show on a ship called the SS Politician, and there was this small island off the coast of Scotland during World War II. Because of wartime rationing, they had run out of whiskey.
Yeah.
And then, lo and behold, a ship grounds itself right off the island, and on board it has 22,000 cases of whiskey.
Wow.
That's like over 250,000 bottles. So they abandon the ship, and then every night the locals start taking boats out, and they start taking the whiskey, and they start stashing the whiskey all over the island. They're burying holes, they're putting it under floorboards. And it's estimated that of the 22,000 cases, they ended up taking 7,000 cases. I mean, there were people like even bringing big boats, taking hundreds of cases of scotch off of it. And it was this, they ended up making a movie about it. In fact, they just did a remake that came out a few years ago called Whiskey Galore, where, this boat wreck kind of brought in all this whiskey to the island. And then it caused a whole lot of problems on top of that. But again, it was just sort of a fascinating story, one that most people probably didn't know about.
Yeah. Where did your desire to learn these things, to learn about history, is that something that you've had for a long time, or did that come with all the travel as well?
No, I've always been like that. Growing up, I was the kid that would read the encyclopedia. And so I've always just known lots of crap. I'm the guy, who, you're talking about somebody and I'm like, oh, actually, and I'm that guy. So this is just kind of this in podcast form. So
Yeah.
I have a working list of show ideas, and it's always being updated. I'm taking stuff off as I do shows, putting stuff on, and the number of ideas has actually grown. So I just finished my 223rd show,
Wow.
and I think I have more ideas on my list than that at this point. And uh, it just keeps growing, and it depends on how much time it takes. So I haven't done today's show yet, and I don't even know what today's show is going to be. But I got a list of stuff,
Yeah.
and some are like, where horses in North America. This is going to require more work, but there were no horses in North America. But we think of Native Americans as being experts at horsemanship, and they were. And what we don't realize is, like, the Comanche went basically in like 1 or 2 generations from having never seen a horse to becoming the best light cavalry in the world. And they just learned it. And there were a lot of people like, well, they must have had horses, or because there's no way you can do that. It's like, no, they did. They did that, and they're just that good at it. And so that's a show I definitely want to do at some point in the future. I have just tons of other small things, interesting stories about, and sometimes they're not even history. It's just like shows where I explain some element of science. I did a show where I was on radiation, and I just explained. People think it's magical death cooties. Like, no, this is how it works. Yeah, it can be bad, but you also don't have to worry about some of it. Because you hear stories in the news, and there's so much bad science in the news all the time. Because you have, history or English majors talking about science, they really don't know what they're talking about.
Yeah. I was going through some of your content, and I saw there was a time where you said, end quote, you resisted the temptation to take a $5 million moon rock in the Solomon Islands.
Oh, yeah. So the Solomon Islands is not a very big country, not a very rich country. In the 1970s, the United States, as part of a goodwill program, gave a moon rock to every country in the world. And it was just a very small hunk of the moon encased in an acrylic sphere, like a big marble, and put it on a plaque, and they gave it to the country. And the Solomon Islands became independent from Britain in 1978. And on the occasion of their independence, President Jimmy Carter gave them a moon rock. And I had been reading prior to arriving in the Solomon Islands that some of these rocks had been stolen. That once we gave them to these countries, some of them were put in museums, others just disappeared. And so people were trying to hunt down where all these moon rocks went, because on the black market, moon rocks are extremely valuable to collectors. Like, there have been cases of black market moon rocks being sold for like $5 million.
Yeah.
To give it an idea.
Wow.
So I was in the Solomon Islands, and I went to this museum. A museum is really kind of, giving it too much credit. It was basically in a tin Quonset hut, and it consisted of mostly artifacts from the Solomons, traditional dress, weapons, things like that, feathers and shells. And then amongst all this, I saw this plaque for Solomon Islands, blah, 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 Jimmy Carter, and it was one of the moon rocks. And it was in this display case that had no lock. And I was like, really? And so I went and I asked the woman who ran, it's like, would you mind if I took this out so I could take a picture of it? She was like, yeah, sure. So I did. And then I wrote this article about the moon rock. And then I was contacted by a lawyer from NASA who had been trying to hunt these things down. And I said, yeah, it's sitting there. And over the years, I haven't gotten an email in a while, but I had emails from people who went to the Solomon Islands in Honiara, and they would give me updates like, moon rock's still there. It's still in the display case. So
that's wild. And those are just things that you would never even think about that you had the opportunity to do. And that's That's what I think is so cool about a lot of the stories that you have. What what is your definition of success?
Setting a goal and achieving it.
Yeah. Is there ever a time where you were traveling and or even now when you've seen all of these things, is there ever a what's next, or how does your mindset go in terms of that?
You just kind of keep a list, and the amount of stuff that I want to see now is bigger than the list when I started traveling,
Mm,
because I'm more aware of what's out there than I was when I started. And it's this problem, like I mentioned, of people just being aware of things. Well, I'm more aware of it now because I've been involved in travel for a very long time. As far as success, I launched this podcast back in July. And I had been through this process over the last several years, growing a website, growing social media channels to, hundreds of thousands of followers. And and so I was kind of starting from scratch again with this podcast. The difference being on Instagram or Twitter and these different things, they have algorithms. And if you can figure out what the algorithm wants, you can grow an audience very quick. There's no podcasting algorithm. It's old fashioned. You have to do stuff like this, like appearing on people's shows and just doing marketing. And so I keep obsessive statistics about my own show, but what I don't do is try to compare myself to everyone else. Because the moment you do that, you go insane.
mm,
It's like, well, Joe Rogan gets 100 million, downloads a month. Well, I'm not Joe Rogan, right?
yeah.
And what a lot of people also don't realize is I didn't even hear of the Joe Rogan podcast until he was on like episode number 800 something. That he had been doing this for years and years, and I had never heard of it before.
Mhm.
And then all of a sudden, a decade later, he's an overnight sensation.
Yeah.
And I think that's so. When I set out to do the show, having done it before, a lot of people, when they start on something new, they envision the success part of it. Like, oh, okay, I will have achieved this, and here's all the rewards I get. And they don't visualize the part of it that sucks, which is like for podcasts, sitting in front of a computer every day, writing a show and then recording it. And that's what I envisioned when I started. It's like, okay, I'm going to have to do that every single day for months and months and months and months. And then at some point, maybe I'll get to a point where it'll be successful.
Right.
And if you want to be success, just keep your own measures of things, constantly be looking to improve, be doing better, but don't compare yourself with someone else because you'll just go nuts.
It's incredible advice there. I always say comparison is the thief of joy, and I believe that's exactly what you just said there. Gary, where can everybody find you if they want to check out your content, your blog? Where are you at online?
Wherever you are listening to this podcast right now, open up that podcast player and just search for Everything Everywhere Daily. And that's where you'll find it.
There it is. Beautiful.
Just add it to your podcast list.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, there's great stuff every single week. And just like you said, we have a variety of topics, and it's quick, short, to the point, but it's knowledge that you probably didn't know before. I don't think I've listened to one yet that I've been like, oh yeah, I knew that. So Gary, thank you so much for spending time here and coming on the show. It was an absolute pleasure to have you, and looking forward to keeping up with you in the future.
Thank you for having me.
All right, y'all. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Breathe and Air podcast, where everyday action meets extraordinary mindset. Today's guest was Gary Arndt, and you can find him at Everything Everywhere. And just like he said, go check out his podcast, Everything Everywhere Daily. Thank you all so much, and have a great rest of your week.